This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times no matter when.
So, thank you. I was kind of counting on my fingers, trying to think about Fromm classes that I've done, and what I've done. And I think this is class number 8 now, this 8th time around, so may there be many more. And I was thinking through, as I've done a couple on symphonies, and I did one on concertos, and I did one on sonatas, and I did one on program music. And I did one where I took one piece a week and covered it, and I've done one of an era. I've only done one other class about a single composer, and that was Beethoven, right? So this is the second time I am devoting an 8-week class to a single composer, and there were only a few composers that I felt were at Beethoven's level of interest and talkability, as it were. Mozart, of course, would have been one. Bach would have been one. There were a few. Me being me, Debussy would have been one. But this man, I think you'd all agree, if I was going to do another single composer class, this really, almost in a way, has to be it. Really, in a way. He has, I think in many ways, Brahms has the most consistent catalog of all of the great composers, and that it's all good stuff. Now, the reason is not because he was a perfect, he hit a bullseye every time by any means. The difference with Brahms is if he felt the piece was below par, it went into his fireplace. And that even includes his early music. He collected it all back when he was older. Pieces he'd given to friends, he got it all back, and he destroyed it. He had a tendency to learn a new genre, like say he was going to write a string quartet for the first time. He wrote one, worked it out, rehearsed it, had it performed, and then destroyed it. I know, it's kind of frustrating. But then he would very quickly write 2 more in quick succession, so very often Brahms' great works come in pairs because he was thinking in 3s. So he's a remarkably consistent composer. He sounded like Brahms from his earliest works. He just got to be more and more like himself as he got older. Beethoven didn't sound like Beethoven until much later, and so on. But it took a while for Beethoven to become Beethoven, And same thing with Mozart, right as well before Mozart became Mozart, But Brahms was Brahms, from the word go. But things may have been a bit different than you may think. So I'm going to start out with Brahms in his old age, 1896. This is right near the end. He wrote, right near the end of his life, he wrote a set of 4 art songs. An art song is known in German as a Lied, plural Lieder, right? That's what we call that. They are on biblical text, and he didn't usually use Bible text for the Lutheran Bible as a rule. He wasn't a particularly religious man. But this time he did. It was the first time since the work Ein Deutsches Requiem, or a German Requiem, 30 years before. Now, he was writing these for a number of reasons, but one of them is that he was reaching that time in his life when everything was winding down. For one thing, Clara Schumann, his dearest friend, lifelong friend, the woman who really in many ways should have been his wife, was not, had always been his mentor and a sounding board. She was dying, and it was very clear that she was going to be gone pretty soon. And other people that had been close to him in his life, they were either gone or going. Now, he may not have known it, but cancer was really starting up. So he didn't have much long to go either. Brahms didn't quite make it to the 20th century. He could have, but he didn't. So if you listen to this particular song we're going to hear, if you know music, if you spent some time in the music world, you would have no trouble. You would say, oh yeah, it's Brahms. It's just absolutely, totally Brahms. Every harmony, every turn of the melody, every aspects of it, including the kind of almost stark beauty of the thing, the total absence of superfluous decoration. Not 1 ounce of frou-frou, just absolutely direct and so on, which is the hardest way to write, of course. Hardest way you'd recognize it. Integrity, oh my. Integrity, this is music absolutely at its purest. No wasted emotions either, but the harmonies are rich. This is very rich sounding harmony, but there's a reservation to it. The melody, although it's incredibly simple, scale steps, a few little things like that, again, it's the hardest thing in the world to write well. It's like a seamstress will tell you the hardest thing to make is a black dress. Simple black dress, right? Making a good omelet, all of that. So you can make you can make good dinner if you have a whole Safeway at your disposal. But what if you have an egg and a cup of water? And that's what we're dealing with a composer that always insisted on working with just the egg and the cup of water. Always. So, this 4 last songs, Opus 121, this is right at the end of it. Its opus numbers are generally chronological. Okay, Dennis Gehete Menschen, this is a classic recording. This is the great bass baritone Hans Halter, one of our greatest ones, with Gerald Moore on the piano. And not surprisingly, by the way, this song is about death and dying and regret and comfort in time to come. It's from Ecclesiastes. That's the text. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them, as the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they have all one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence above a beast, for all is vanity. That's in the German Requiem, that line too. All go unto one place, all are of the dust, and all turn to dust again. Who knoweth the spirit of man that goeth upward, and the spirit of the beast that goeth downward to the earth? Wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? Just think for a moment before I play it. Just think to yourself for a moment. How would you set something like that to music? In my case, I think very poorly, actually. But in fact, how would you bring out the dignity and the depth of a text like that? Well, I think you'll agree with me when you hear it. Oh, he does it. Oh, does he do it?
Nichts mehr denn das
Some song. Simple, direct, to the point. How does it happen? The kid, skinny, spindly, attractive little kid, son of a mediocre town musician, born and raised in the poorest sections of a port city in Germany. How can a kid like that turn into this great universal master? How can this happen? How can this journey happen? Well, this is our topic. 8 weeks is not enough to cover it, but I'll do my best. I'll try. It was a long evolution. He was not an overnight prodigy. He was not a Mozart by any means. But he became a titan, of course, and that is our subject. Now, his life wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like a showbiz life like Liszt, with women throwing their jewelry at him on stage and, princesses as his consorts. Or Wagner ahead of the cops at every step and finally building a theater to his own glory and becoming, of course, the most controversial person. And, no, wasn't one of those at all. But it was an extraordinary intellectual and artistic journey. And that's where I'm going to focus. The externals of his life are really not all that thrilling. I mean, mostly he got up in the morning, he wrote music, he had lunch, he went to bed. That was it. Of course, that's what they all do, right? But inside, there was a great deal. I'm going to try to understand the man's mind a little bit. It's hard to, because he was a very difficult person in many ways. But I'm going to try, do what I can do. So, it begins. Dun-ta-da! May 7th, 1833. This is the birth date. So he belongs in the second generation of Romantics. The first come around 1810 or so. That's Mendelssohn, Schumann, Liszt, Wagner, Verdi. That group, they all come around 1810. He's 1833. So another generation. And he was born in Hamburg, that Hanseatic city, port city, tough town. It was a tough town. It was not an artistic town. It was a port town. It was full of sailors and warehouses and docks and working people. It was not a bad city. It was a working class city. It was not a city to launch a career. It's not like he was born in Vienna or Paris. Here's his dad. Now, Johann Jakob, he was a professional musician. He wasn't a very good one, but he was. But what he did, he's very familiar to anyone who knows the Bay Area, who some violinist or pianist or singer comes to San Francisco, somehow or other, lives in an apartment with 12 other people, and starts freelancing. And you see them all over town. Every time somebody's playing music in the background, that's what they're doing. so on. Or if things get really bad, maybe they're sitting down on Powell Street BART station, you know. But he was starting out that way, and at first he was hardly making any money at all, of course. He had no real connections or so on. But he was managing just barely. He was scraping by, barely getting enough to eat, living in little flea bag apartments, but he was making it. He eventually did better, but never that well. Never all that well. He was always a very humble, very lower middle class type musician. So the best he could do would be like a town band. That was about the best he could hope for. Now what's interesting is he married rather well. We only have a picture of his wife in her older age, so I always see her with those very high cheekbones, you know, and that she almost looks like a Dickens character, doesn't she? She should have some wonderful name like Miss Poppycock or something, you know. But in fact, Christiana, she was of good ancestry, good family. She even had a Vaughn in her name, but they were all very poor. She was older than Jakob, quite a bit older, but when they got married in 1830, it appears to have been a very happy marriage. Now, she is a very important person in Johannes Brahms' life because apparently she was a gloriously good mother. We don't know a lot about her, but she was supportive, she was loving, and she was a great lover of learning, which he became. He was quite an intellectual in many ways. And so everything we hear about her is very, very positive. And they had 3 children, by the way, and she did her best. So I really wish we had something of her also when she was little. I'd like to see how she changed over the years. I'd love to know more about her, but we just don't. She's as shadowy as Beethoven's mother is, you know, it's just this very hardworking person, but apparently very, very fine person. At the time Johannes was born, this awful, look at that thing. It's falling apart. Now, this was taken around the turn of the 20th century, and it was very close to getting condemned at that point. So as obviously it should have been. It's a 24 Specs Gong, which is a very bad neighborhood, you know, and so on. They lived in a little ground floor apartment that apparently it's 2 rooms. And you can barely stand up in it. Could be. Somebody described it many years later. However, it gives you a false impression of his upbringing because they moved out of it quite soon. So Brahms himself would have no memory of this house. They moved into better ones, and by 1841, so when our guy was 9 years old, they were living in a decent lower middle class neighborhood, working class and so on. So Johannes was middle child, older sister who is a homebody person. She apparently went on 1 trip in her whole life and mostly just worked, and a younger brother who was a rather feckless type, and who Johannes tried to help him with jobs in music that never seemed to quite pan out. His name was Felix, by the way. So can you imagine being a sort of mediocre musician and having that last name? Ooh, yeah. Which, by the way, means broom. His name was John Broom, Johnny Broom. Okay, so our boy, so just so you know that. Now, it didn't matter. One of the good things that he had is that even if Dad was a mediocre musician, Dad was a musician. And Dad could recognize that his middle son had talent. There was no question. It was an explosive, volcanic, fabulous talent. And as a result, he started giving the little boy piano lessons right away. Now, there were only particular times in their life when they even could have a piano. Most of the time they couldn't. But from time to time, he was getting musical instruction, usually on things like flute and, you know, violin and whatever they could have around the house, by the time he was 4 years old. And I think we can count on the fact, I think he probably moved very quickly. They knew that this kid had a great gift. They didn't know how much. Who would? So he did get, pretty early on, he got a good teacher. Brahms was blessed with having good teachers. He really was. And this man, Otto Friedrich Willibald Kossel was the kind of young musician I think all of us really wish we really were in our hearts. For one thing, he was totally dedicated to teaching the piano, and he was dedicated especially to teaching worthwhile young students who didn't have money. And he taught them for free most of the time, or very little money. He would give them lessons every day. And he was just as poor as they were. Totally dedicated. And with this incredible little boy that he got, this bright, wonderful little boy, he saw that. And so he gave him a perfect beginning. Brahms had one of the most solid piano educations a kid can have. Now, admittedly, it was dry. He had to play Clementi and Czerny and all that, dingy, 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 ding stuff, all that. That was already established, even then. And remember, Czerny was still alive at this point, so they were torturing the little, kids with that even back then. But the fact is, it is good stuff. You learn your hand positions, your fingerings, you learn how to get around the piano, and you learn a lot of discipline, if nothing else, just sitting there and putting up with that stuff, which is discipline, right? So he did. Now, the big thing, though, was that Kossel had been a student of Eduard Marxsen. Every city, it doesn't matter whether you have a lot of culture or not, every city always has some piano teacher who's the best one. It's Marxsen here in Hamburg. And Marxsen was a first-class musician. And so, after a while, Kossel, who was so impressed with his little boy, started saying, "You've really got to go play for my teacher." And there he is. 1845, Johannes was 12 years old. He got to play for the big man himself. Now, it's interesting that at first Marxsen didn't want to take him. He didn't. He thought, well, he's good, but not that good. And I only take the best, and I don't think this kid's the best. He's talented, but, Those of you who heard my Christmas talk know that I was kind of that kid too. He's good, but I don't know, that. Now, what's interesting, he gave him a very good upbringing. Later in life, Brahms said he didn't teach him a thing. Ingrate. But it turns out they kind of split the work, as that Marxsen really began teaching Brahms in all the rudiments of composition learning. Form, harmony, counterpoint, all that stuff they need to learn. But almost everybody thought at that time that Brahms was going to have a future as a pianist. And nobody really thought that he had much promise as a composer at first. He wasn't a Mozart. It was slow growth. And besides, then as now, you could not make a living as a composer. And Jakob was very worried that his little boy be able to make a living in music. Even if it was playing at the Powell Street BART station, he wanted to make sure. But Marxsen understood a little. Here he is. He's speaking to a great conductor, Hermann Levy, in 1873, when, of course, Brahms was a rock star by then. His restless eagerness and application awakened my interest more and more. And the manifestly rapid progress strengthened my opinion that an extraordinary God-given talent was here to be developed. I even taught him without any financial return for the necessary period. If you know a musician, you know that's a big deal. From the beginning of the studies, a clear and deep thinking spirit was apparent, and yet later on, original creation became difficult for him and required a real amount of encouragement on my side. We also busied ourselves with the study of form. Nonetheless, the talent quickly developed, in my opinion, more beautifully and significantly, even though at the time he had not produced a great work. In other words, he learned the hard way, he did it well, and he got it rock solid. This is a composer who built on a cement foundation. He had it. So let's find out a little bit about Marxsen here. Marxsen was a composer. And I find him very interesting because the fact is he was a very good, generic, early Romantic composer. That's my impression, I think, will be yours too. This is one of his piano sonatas. It's the last movement of it. And it's, in my opinion, it's beautifully made. It's a perfectly crafted rondo. You know how those work? I'll show you in a moment to remind you. However, it has absolutely no distinguishing features whatsoever. And if I had heard it, like I heard it on the radio and somebody said, "Scott, who is this?" I'd say, "Oh, it's Carl Maria von Weber, it's Hummel, it's Czerny, I don't know who the hell it is, But the fact is it could sound like almost anybody from that time. So he didn't have a lot of personality, but he had craft, good craft. So it's a rondo, it's a 5-part rondo. Rondos work as follows, just to remind, here's your theory lesson today, okay? A rondo has a reprise. That's the main body of music. Okay? It's a cyclic form, and that reprise comes back periodically, always in the same key. Always. Sometimes it's shortened when it comes back, sometimes not. It is potentially deadly dull with that reprise coming back like that. So you get to number 3, and like the dog is sitting there going, "Oh, what again?" That reprise. Now you contrast that with what we call either episodes or excursions. The names are used. Those are in a different key and they're a different style. Most composers will also decorate things a bit by adding a coda, at the end. A coda is Italian for tail, and a little tail piece at the end of it. There might also be transitions in between. In the case of this piece, there are not. And so I'm using a very broad chart for this piece. I'm not going to go phrase by phrase or anything. I think you will find very pleasant, very good, very solid. You will hear it, and you will never, ever remember it again. Yeah? Let's see what you think. Here we go. Coming, can't you? Got it. Not a bad little piece, right? Nothing you'd ever want to hear more than once. And so on. But I'm so glad that Brahms worked with somebody like this, because most of the early romantics were terrible at form. They were just like free souls that just wrote stream of consciousness. And there's nothing wrong with that, but as a teacher, Brahms needed somebody with structure. And he got him. Brahms was to be the most disciplined of all the late romantics, one of the great disciplined composers, and it all starts with Markson, and really sowing these seeds of craftsmanship in him. There he is. I'll let you see that, but he was beautiful, by the way. We always think of Brahms as being big and bearded and gruff and all that, but that was only in later life. He was a little slender, itty-bitty little thing, little toothpick arms. He was a featherweight with a perfect peaches and cream complexion, cornflower blue eyes, and blonde hair. He looked like a little angel. He wasn't, but he looked like one. And he looked way younger, even in his 40s. He looked like he was in his 20s. When he was in his 20s, he looked like he was barely pubescent. And I think one of the reasons he grew the beard later on is because he just thought people weren't taking him seriously enough. They're all sort of chucking him under the chin and coochie coochie coo, and they couldn't stand it anymore. So we find some very early compositions of his, and the very earliest ones are just generic pieces, but they're not bad. This piece called Souvenirs of Russia, and these are Russian folk tunes transcribed for two pianos. He wrote them under a pseudonym, G.W. Marks, I think a play on his teacher's name, It was for a publisher who put out these volumes of Russian folk song arrangements, and so, almost paid almost nothing, but a little bit. And so about 1850 is when he wrote it, so he was a teenager. Now, Brahms, who normally destroyed all of his early works because he didn't want them getting out. See, he didn't want any of us knowing that he couldn't write when he was little, right? But because it got published, he couldn't get it back. So he never acknowledged it as his own. It took later scholars to realize, oh, that's Brahms. I got one. One of those early ones. And that's why. It is absolutely insignificant trivia, but if we know that Brahms to come, and we know those great Hungarian dances of his, you're going to be surprised. It's already there. Even this early, it's already there. So I'm mentioning on here, this is what I just said, he destroyed his early works as much as he could. He did not want biographers getting a hold of them or anyone else, but this one made it through, and it's one of the only one of his teenage or childhood works that have made it through his filter. So it's all the more valuable for it. So here it is. This is a Bohemian song, Coca, from Souvenir de la Russe, by Brahms. This is him as a teenager. That's about how he looked when he was. As you can see, he was a very pretty young man, wasn't he? And he was about 5 feet tall. He got a little bit bigger later on. He grew late. But a little bitty thing. You could pick him up with one hand, I think, So, little bitty thing. So, here we go. Pictures of Brahms. So you can tell he was already a hotshot pianist, right? Writing stuff like that. And I love those pictures because they are so contrary to our cultural depictions of Brahms, and to see what he was like. He had a growth spurt in his late teens, and he wound up normal height and a little better. But as a young man, he was an itty-bitty, teeny-weeny little thing, so on. So he was a great writer of the art song from a very early age. He is sometimes forgotten a little bit about that. People forget that of the great triumvirate of art song writers, Schubert, Schumann, Brahms is the third of the leader. And that was very early. This is a man who wrote a lot of art songs. His very first one is called Heimkehr. It's from 1851. And like many of these early works that survived, he tucked it into a later collection, so it has a later opus number. So you look at it, it's like opus 13 or something, and you think it's a later work. It's interesting because it's got problems. It's overwritten. It's 20 measures long, and it's really melodramatic and fustian, and the climax is way over the top for such a little bitty piece. But this kind of mistake, overwriting, was very rare. This is one of the few Brahms pieces I can actually point to and say there's a flaw here. But it's still pretty cool. It really is. It's still a pretty cool piece. So this is, see, it's published as Opus 7, which is nowhere near. This is Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, the great German baritone, doing this. He's going to ham it up a little bit. Fischer-Dieskau had a tendency, I don't know if you know this, he could get really hammy once in a while. Most of the time he was quite severe and, he was quite intellectual, but every once in a while he let his hair down a little bit. And it's kind of fun to hear him do it. He does that in this.
Brich nicht steckt, zitterst sehr, du stürzt nicht, fällst, du dreuest schwer. Wind, geh nicht unter, Himmel, fall nicht ein, Himmel, fall nicht ein, bis ich mag bei der Liebsten sein, bis ich mag bei der Liebsten sein, bis ich mag bei der Liebsten sein.
Wow. It really stirs it up there for a minute, It's a good thing that's in a bunch of other songs. Could you imagine doing that just by itself, He got better fast. Next year, he wrote a lot more songs, and one of those is the Spanish song. It's also brief, but it's masterfully written, beautifully done, and it's evocative. It's got a Spanish flair to it. And so it also has gotten a somewhat more, shall we say, less hammy performance, this time out of the glorious Jessie Norman, who is one of our great Brahms singers. She really is. And so this piece is just a few down the line from that one. It's not very far, despite the opus number. Just listen to how much he's improved in terms of controlling his emotions and all of that. Here we go.
In dem Schatten meiner Locken schlief mir mein Geliebter ein. Weck ich ihn nun auf,
Well, how good is that? It's beautifully done, beautifully done. As a theory teacher, I can tell you there's some Brahms harmonic practices in there that we all recognize, and it sounds like Brahms. The other one doesn't, but this one does. He moved, once he got going, he developed very, very quickly. So at this point, I need to bring up the question of his very early days. Did he or did he not play piano in a bordello? This is always, now he said he did. But as an older man, he was going to over-dramatize things, right? I could just hear him, and so on. I had to play in this bordello with all these awful people around me, blah, 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 so on. There's no question he did play in something, okay? This is from Malcolm McDonald's biography of him. He was obliged to take engagement playing the piano in the many drinking and wenching dives of the notorious St. Pauli area near the harbor. English accounts of his early life usually rendered these establishments as bars, taverns, or dance halls, because musicologists are a bunch of, stuffed shirts, basically. Our language, in fact, provides no exact equivalent for this word animi er locale, which basically I like to translate as gentleman's club, sort of like that, like in Las Vegas, Stimulation saloons. That's what it means, literally. And the stimulus was musical, alcoholic, or sexual. It was like a downstairs where you went to watch the dancing girls and to talk and to buy a drink, and it turns out the girls were for purchase as well, upstairs. But they were not technically bordellos. You know, it was right on the edge, right? Bordellos were legal, and they were licensed, and they were regulated in Hamburg. It's a port town. Of course it's going to be, right? So as MacDonald goes on to tell us, he said, providing nonstop dance music late into the night in rooms thronged by prostitutes and sailors straight off their ships, the sensitive Johannes saw a daunting amount of lowlife in the raw just as he himself was entering puberty. Upon this background, some biographers have erected elaborate speculations concerning his later difficulties in relations with women, and boy, did he have them. Whatever the truth may be, the experience undoubtedly left its scars. At a very early age, he could retain few romantic illusions about the opposite sex, let alone about his own. And MacDonald, by the way, he's not another writer, I think it's Swafford, goes on to point out that these places, no doubt the prostitutes probably sort of enjoyed him. He was a pretty boy, right? And as he pointed out, those sailors might have too. So we don't know, right? We simply do not know. Now, there are some other writers that say absolutely not. You know, they say absolutely not. For example, this chap, for example, Hoffmann, his book on Brahms, the Hamburg musician, it is out of the question that he could have played for dancing in bordellos, because the statute says regulation concerning bordellos and prostitution specifies no landlords or girls should permit entry to young people under the age of 20. And paragraph 16, it says that all dance music is forbidden in bordellos. Oh boy, I wonder how far that went, huh? When Brahms commented on alluded in later years to playing in sailors' taverns, he was really appealing to the cult of the hero so prevalent in the 19th century. He could be certain that the people with whom he was with in conversation would admire his rise as a genius from such a background all the more. There's some truth in that, I'm sure. I mean, what great artist later in life doesn't want to tell you how hard they ever had it? I remember Gregor Piatigorsky, right, the great cellist, once talking to us at a master class at Peabody about when he was a young student in Paris. He was so poor that he'd get a cast-off piece of liver from a butcher's and heat it up on a match, you know. And I'm thinking, oh, you did not, you know. Liar, you know. But, you know, of course you couldn't say that. Oh, that must have been terrible, you know. And you know, so you're going, yeah, right. But I think the truth is somewhere in between. For one thing, he wasn't playing in bordellos. So he was playing in these gentlemen's clubs, so I'm sure, so on. But and it was a port city. Do you think they followed the law that much? Come on, it was a port town. I think he did. I think he did, and I think he probably lost his virginity there, in fact. That's just me. That's just me. But I think he probably did, though they probably weren't officially bordellos. I'm going to think he just played in the gentlemen's club and so on. But I think he had to. The family was poor, and he had to make a buck. And we also know that around this time he was having all kinds of fainting spells and problems because the kid was too young for any of this. They would be now, right? And so it was rough. Well, during these early years, what he was mostly writing was piano music because the kid was a whale of a pianist. He was an amazing pianist. And unlike the vocal music, which is just a curiosity, some of it has remained in many pianist repertoire. I'm sorry, there's an extra "the" there. In many pianist repertoire, some of it has. However, as a young composer, his tendency was towards melodrama, towards fustian grandiosity, towards writing pieces that required basically the physiology of Godzilla to play, and so on. You know, and that was his tendency in those days. It really was. And so we have to accept that these early piano works very often are fiendishly difficult, just in terms of physical, just getting through the thing, and so on. You got to eat your Wheaties, in other words, and so on. And apparently he could play them with ease, so he must have been something. He must have been something. Now, the piano sonata in F minor, this is one of the first Brahms pieces for piano that really gets played. It's printed with, again, a later opus number than it should have. This piece, it's effective, but it is definitely written for pianists with big bones. You know, the Lazar Berman types, you know, these big pianists. And you've got to be able to thunder out nonstop octaves all the time and big massive chords, which means this is a piece I will never, ever play. I'm not built for this. You know, I'm more the surgical and, you know, precision type player. I can't do these sort of pieces. I can do like 10 seconds of it, you know, and then I need hospitalization if I do any more, right? So, now there's a scherzo movement. Remember, a scherzo is like a minuet on steroids. It's the third movement of a big sonata. It's in triple meter, it's fast as opposed to slow, and typically it's it's a display piece. Beethoven pioneered it, Brahms took it over. This is a really good movement. I mean, as much as my reservations about playing this sort of stuff, this is a heck of a good movement. It really is. Now, remember, we're in the mid-19th century here. Think about what's going on in the arts. Caspar David Friedrich with all those beautiful Gothic paintings of his. This is Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein. Bram Stoker's Dracula is right around the corner. There's this fascination with the Gothic, the Fuseli portraits of all the nightmares. Everybody was fascinated in the darkest Shakespeare plays. They were all into Macbeth, and how this is that fascination with Gothic horror. This is, vampire stories and all this. This was all part of this era, and they were all Faust crazy, right? Selling your soul to the devil, and all of this. And this is the period that Liszt is going to write a piece like the Totentanz, the Dance of Death. And they're all writing stuff with the Dies Irae, the Requiem Mass. So this is all this period. Well, Brahms wasn't immune to this. He was fascinated by it. And so this is a great example of this. This is almost a devil's waltz, this movement. It really is. There's a middle section trio, which gives us relief, of course, the middle part, and we need that very much. It's also a brilliant exploration of what you can do with music if you're just using chords, because it almost has no melody. It's just chords. So in other words, it's a masterful composition. I cannot think of any other mid-romantic who could have written this well except for maybe Mendelssohn with this level of craft. But none of them had this depth, this testosterone that he shows in this. And so I chose a recording that takes it to the max. And that, of course, is Arthur Rubinstein. He was the big bone pianist for this. And when he recorded this in 1959, he played these spots off of it. Subtle? No. Good? Yes. So, the scherzo. Let me give you a rundown of the form. Another theory lesson. Then we'll take our break after we hear it. Part 1, 2 phrases, right? A, repeat with modification. New phrase B, repeat with modification. What we call a 2-part song form. Part 2, single phrase. Part 3 is a shortened version of Part 1. Typical ABA form, ternary like that. Then the trio, which that middle part, 2 phrases, 1 repeated, a special repeat of 1 phrase in the middle, and then that. So it's very simple. And then we go back and do the Part 1, 2, and 3. We do that again. It's what's called a da capo. Yep. And these will come up as we go. It'll animate, and just watch along as it goes. And, of course, a little transition to take us back. transitions go. That thing makes my wrist hurt just listening to it, you know. But amazing, isn't it? I mean, this is a teenager wrote this and so on. It's something. Now, before he could move on now from here, he had gone about as far as he could with Hamburg resources. He was going to have to meet those people that could help him and get him along in life now. That was about to happen. And we will talk about that after the break. All right. I'd like to have you back about 5 after or so if I could, please. If there's long lines, we'll see. All right. Thank you. So on. Speaking of reading, as you remember, many of you, I always put my slides online for your perusal. They don't have the music on them because that would be a copyright violation to do that. But everything is on there. You just go to my personal website, and all you have to do is spell my name right. That's a challenge. But Foglesong, all one word, .com, and that will get you there. And then you will find a link to Fromm. I will have my slides on there. And also, I'll do some listening lists for you, let you know what my recordings are, so on. If you get on there and things aren't there, just nag me. I forget sometimes to update it. I always put the slides up after the class, not before. So sometime like this evening, I'm going to put up these slides for you. That's why I put so much writing on them, so you can go back over and read them and so on. So just let you know, though, they will be available to you. If you don't see them by about Saturday, drop me an email and nag me. Okay? Where are those slides, huh? So let us move on. Brahms' professional career began the way many of our professional careers began. Somebody asked him to become his accompanist. That's how mine started, too. And he caught the attention of a Hungarian violinist named Eduard Remenyi. And Remenyi had been a student of Joseph Joachim. Those of us who know music always think of Joachim as being this bearded patriarch. At this point, he was a kid. But Remenyi was studied with him, and Remenyi hired Johannes as his accompanist. This is a good gig. They originally got along very well, and at first they were just playing little showpieces, you know, violin bonbons with the piano going yong chunk chunk boom chuck chuck boom chuck chuck boom chuck, you know, that sort of stuff. But they started playing more substantial stuff. Beethoven sonatas and the like, and they actually started giving concerts in North Germany. I mean, they were, you know, Hamburg and suburbs, right? That whole area where you could get easily to by train. Now, the thing about their partnership, though, is that I think it was plagued from the beginning. It really was. They went on a big tour together, and they even went to Hanover, you know, which is a big town. Well, this is when something tremendously important happened. And that is that Joachim, who was still very young himself, he was the concertmaster of the Hanover Orchestra, and this is where he and Brahms met. We will talk about that a little bit more, but very quickly, Joachim and Brahms hit it off. They became friends and soulmates, artistically as well as personally. Now, Remigny, I've worked with violinists like Remigny. I got to tell you about these guys. It's, as far as they're concerned, the accompanist is second, 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 second. Even if you're playing sonata literature, like the Beethoven sonatas, where it's an equal partnership, they're always saying, you're too loud, you're too loud, you're too loud, which means they can hear you. You're too loud, right? You know, I once had one of those people that literally made me not only close the piano all the way up, she actually put the blanket over it. You know, it's like I'm saying, well, why did you hire me at all? Maybe somebody could just sit there and pretend to play, you know, and this is what he was like. He was not a very good musician, you know, he was kind of mediocre. And as a matter of fact, he also got very, very jealous for two reasons. The first is that Brahms was stealing his thunder. You see, even with Brahms sort of relegated to, you know, second status there, it was really clear who the good musician was, and it wasn't Remigny. And then the other problem, well, this picture says it all. Remigny was a perfectly ordinary looking man. His accompanist was a GQ model. You know? And the fact is, people were flocking to their concerts to ooh and ah over the gorgeous pianist, you know, and all this. And so he was way better looking, and he was way better musician. So poor Remigny is there like, well, I guess I'm going to play the violin for you, you know, and so on. So the whole thing began to break on that. It really did. The whole thing began to go. These relationships usually do. Let's face it, you know. So it did. It started, and it started sniping, and Remigny started, you know, insulting Brahms all the time. And even as a young man, Brahms had a very hot temper. It didn't last. It just didn't last. But Joachim. Now this is a different matter. Different matter. Let me tell you a little bit about Joseph Joachim. At age 12, he was taken in as a private student of Felix Mendelssohn. At age 17, he was appointed professor of violin at the Leipzig Conservatory. At age 20, he was the conductor of the Hanover Symphony. He was of course, obviously unbelievably good violinist, but what he really was a musician of rare depth. And he lived for a long time, and he had a long career. Joachim is the first of the critical friends that Brahms made. He was Brahms' soulmate in every which way. He was to the violin what Brahms was to the composition. Just to look ahead here, he is the violinist for whom Brahms wrote the Great Violin Concerto. That's him. And so on. He is the first of these critically important people. Now, like all of the people who became heartfelt friends with Johannes Brahms, typically the friendships worked better in theory than in practice. Brahms was a hard person to get along with, and all of his closest friends had to forgive him a lot. But Joachim was no shrinking violet either. He was temperamental, he was an artist, he had that whole thing. He was introverted, he was moody, and all that. But there has never been a violinist who graced our profession as much as he did. This is one of the greatest of them all, without question. Heifetz, yeah, great violinist, great player. Joachim, artist. Total, absolute artist. And bless his heart, he lived long enough to record. Thank God. And he was still playing really well when he was in his late 70s and 80s and so on. He was still playing beautifully, so on. And even better, he recorded some Brahms. Yes! You know, his closest friend and colleague, this person, we've got him playing a Brahms Hungarian Rhapsody in his own arrangement for violin and piano. Folks, you're hearing it from the horse's mouth here. Ready? That's what I call an historical document. By the way, the reason for the pictures of Leopold Auer, those two I had, like all really great artists, Joachim was also a teacher. I mean, he taught a lot. He was the ranking violin teacher of the late 19th century, Leipzig Conservatory, right? That's the Juilliard of Europe. One of his students was Leopold Auer. Leopold Auer taught everybody in the 20th century. His students include Heifetz, Nathan Milstein, those sort of people. So the tradition went on with Joachim, and that great Olympian teaching of his went on with people like Leopold Auer. So, and again, Joachim was the absolute perfect person for Brahms to meet at this time. Now, when Joachim was not in Hanover, he was in Göttingen, where he was going back to school. He had a very restless and a very fine intellect, so he was studying arts and sciences and literature. He was a literature nut. And Brahms went to stay with him in Göttingen. They hit it off, this little dorm room of his, basically, and they both stayed in it, and then stay up all night talking literature and books. This is the time that Brahms named himself Young Chrysler, after the mad figure of Johannes Chrysler from a play by E.T.A. Hoffmann. And he began calling himself Young Chrysler, which he was to sign his manuscript as that for the next 5 years or so. Very romantic, very literary. He and Joachim started writing letters, long letters back and forth. They were talking literature, they were talking poetry, painting, philosophy, sometimes music. You know, it was a perfect partnership. Even early on, Joachim had to recognize that Brahms was probably the moodiest person he had ever met. And so sometimes the guy was a real pill to be around. But then again, Joachim was not always a saint-like person either. These are artist folks, you know, they are. But after this, after he met Joachim and they formed this relationship and spent all this time with him, Brahms went on, I guess, what is it I would want to call this? I'm not sure. Maybe a Wunderjahr. He did something that students have done throughout history. Put on a backpack, had a little money, probably some granola bars or the equivalent, and he went walking down the Rhine. He had a wonderful time. Wonderful time. Student style, he'd stay in a pension if he found one, or he'd sleep out in the open, or meet somebody that had a tent, or, you can sleep in our house, or whatever. And he just went on foot. He was writing letters back to his family whenever he could, and so on, and he was having a wonderful time. Well, he got to Cologne, they're on the Rhine, and Joachim had really been bugging him about this a lot. He said, there's some people you must meet. You've got to meet these people. You've got to meet them. Now, Brahms had already sent this couple a manuscript, and it had been returned just returned to return mail without comment. So I thought, well, I don't want to go meet these people. They don't like my music, you know. But Joachim is saying, no, 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 no. And here's a letter of introduction. Go meet them. So he got on the train, and he went to Dusseldorf, and to meet the first couple of the king and queen of European music. They were to become those two remaining critically important relationships. There were three in his life. Joachim was the first. There he is about the time he met them. It was October the 1st, 1853, and it was 11 a.m. in the morning. How's that for cool? He knocked on the door. The husband and wife had 5 children at this point. The youngest daughter, Marie, remembered him as a very young man, handsome as a prince, with long blonde hair. Those old photographs never make him look like a blonde, but he was. So he went in to a rather modest house in Dusseldorf. These were not wealthy people at all. His host, please come in. So Johannes sat down at the piano, and he began playing a new sonata in C major, which was actually after that F minor one I played for you, but it was the first one he published. And he started playing it. That's not Brahms playing, of course, I'm sorry. That's Julius Katchen. But his host touched him on the shoulder after about a minute, which is about what I played for you, and said, hang on. He said, when he said, I got to call my wife. She's got to hear this. She's got to hear this. Honey, where are you? You know, like that, right? And so on. You got to hear this guy, you know, and so on. And at that moment, he met them. How many of you know who I'm talking about? Robert and Clara Schumann. Robert and Clara Schumann. Of course, that's Robert on the right. Let me tell you a little bit about them, okay? Just so we have a little time here, let me tell you about them. Now, Robert Schumann, to begin with, was at the absolute peak of his powers as a composer. And at this time, in 1853, he had come roaring out in the 1830s as a challenging avant-gardist, and he was. All these fascinating little piano miniatures that sort of explored all new areas of the piano music, a kind of a neo-Freudian approach to music writing, where he had all these characters, Florestan and Eusebius, Mastroianni, who are all these his own inner consciousness. They were like the id and the superego, and they were all in this music, as well as portraits of people that he knew. These pieces, which were very challenging, they're not hard to play, but they're hard to figure out. And these incredible art songs, the best since Schubert. I mean, just fabulous stuff. When he was a young man, he was studying piano with a mean old buzzard of a piano teacher named Friedrich Wieck. And Friedrich Wieck, mean old guy, had a daughter who he was grooming to be the next great pianist, and she was a brilliant super talent on the piano. Her name was Clara Wieck. She was a teenager. Schumann, Robert met her, they met, and bit by bit they fell very deeply in love. He was almost a Brahms level of pulchritude. You know, he's a very good-looking man. But she was underage, and Friedrich Wieck was not about to let his precious daughter throw herself away on this penniless dreamer of a composer who was probably never going to make a dime. Despite the fact that Schumann was brilliant, had been a law student for a while and so on, he came from a literary family. He was he was a very fine young man, but he was the kind of, I think, young man most fathers wish their daughters would not meet. So on. And so Wieck objected, of course, strenuously to all of this. Well, a couple of things happened. One is that Robert, who was always impatient about everything, he was never going to be much of a pianist anyway, but then he used this silly thing called a chiroplast to exercise his hands, and he wound up ripping some of his tendons. And so that's the end of that piano career. Not that that was ever any loss, but it did. And he had to become more focused on music and so on. So that happened, so he was never going to be a pianist, and then Clara became of age. So they got married. They never got Papa Wieck's permission. It's a good thing it hasn't arrived yet. So on. And he had a very difficult relationship with the father-in-law and son-in-law forever, but it was an absolute love match. But it was not easy. Clara Schumann, who became, the second, Franz Liszt and Clara Schumann are the greatest pianists of the 19th century, maybe with Anton Rubinstein as well. But she was an artist, folks, with everything that means. She was melancholy. She was prone to fits of hysteria and melancholy. She was also, this is sort of endearing, she was accident prone, bless her little heart. She was always tripping on things and, spraining this and busting that and breaking that and so on. Robert, on the other hand, suffered from what we would now call a bipolar disorder, and it was a whopper. He had a terrible one. His family had it, and he went through these, elation to despair. When he was elated, that's when he composed. So if you take a look, you find out almost all of his early piano music is within about the same 1.5 year period. Hey, guess who was in the manic state, right? And then it falls away, and then we have what we call the year of song. He wrote almost all of his great song cycles, like Die Liebe and Liederkreis, all in the same year. It all came pouring out. Clara, on the other hand, brilliant pianist, and she was beginning to tour. She was making a big name for herself. Well, they began having children, and she became mom. And so bit by bit, she more or less retired from the concert stage, while Robert made most of his income, not as a composer, because it doesn't pay, but as a journalist. He was a damn good one. He had founded a thing called the New Journal for Music, which became the go-to magazine for European music. He also had a wonderful eye for young talent, or so it said. I'll tell you more about that a little bit next week. It wasn't as good as people say it was. But the fact is, his very first issue of the Neue Zeitschrift, the New Journal, he had spotted a young, rising Polish composer named Chopin. Yeah, and so on. Well, he had another one to deal with. So this is where they were. Now, as of this point, Robert Schumann had been hired as the conductor of the Dusseldorf Orchestra. Dusseldorf was not a Class A orchestra. I would say it's like getting, like Louisville, something, a very good orchestra, very good one. It wasn't Vienna, it wasn't Hamburg, it wasn't Munich, but it was good. And had been brought in the previous year as the conductor. And everybody was very excited because the great Herr Schumann, who had also, by the way, become a very good symphonist, he had developed into a marvelous writer of symphonies. His concerto that he wrote for Clara, the A minor piano concerto, it's a standard, He had hit the ground running, and they found out that Robert Schumann was simply not cut out to be anybody's music director. A conductor's job, a music director's job, is 99% offstage. And one of their biggest jobs is the way they build an orchestra, the people they hire, the rehearsals, the inspiration they find. That's what they do. What they do on the podium isn't so important. I mean, it is, but it's not. Schumann couldn't do that stuff. And under him, with his horrible rehearsals, he had no rehearsal technique at all. His stick technique was non-existent. During concerts, he would get so enwrapped in the music, he would just stop conducting. And he's like, And orchestras faced with that sort of thing fall to pot very quickly. Those of you with some memories might remember that in the 1950s, after Pierre Monteau was our conductor here, we had a guy named Enrique Horda for a while. Well, Horda was electrifying in concert, but his rehearsal technique, there was none. He just talked. And so the orchestra started falling to pieces. It was in terrible shape by the time he left. They fired him, but by the time he was gone. Well, Dusseldorf was in terrible shape. In 1853, the board was talking about firing him and they didn't know how to do it. So, in other words, the time that Brahms met him, they were in trouble, big trouble. They sort of knew it, but they didn't. 5 kids. Clara had pretty much given up her performing life. Robert had this job in Dusseldorf. Money was tight. They didn't have a big fancy house or anything. But whatever flaws they had as human beings, don't we all? We all have these flaws. These are good people. They are good-hearted people. They're people of tremendous integrity. They were. And so therefore, when this young man came to them, they realized what they had on their hands. Robert Schumann needed about 13 seconds with Brahms. Oh, wow. Clara didn't need much longer. And I think Clara was probably stunned by how good-looking the guy was. And frankly, I think so was Robert. There's very good reason to think that he was bisexual. Okay, so doesn't matter, but still, I just start throwing it. It's the soap opera part, right? So they met him. They spent the afternoon with him, talked to him. He moved into a little pension nearby so he could be near them. He became very quickly another member of the family. And don't forget, he wasn't much older than their oldest child. So don't forget that. So that night, Clara wrote in her diary, "Here again is one of those who comes as if sent straight from God. He played his sonatas, scherzos, etc. of his own, all of them showing exuberant imagination, depth of feeling, and mastery of form. Robert says there was nothing he could tell him to take away or add. It is really moving to see him sitting at the piano with his interesting young face, which becomes transfigured when he plays, his beautiful hands, which overcome the greatest difficulties with perfect ease." These things are very difficult, and she'd know. "And in addition, these remarkable compositions." That's what she wrote that night. Robert also kept a diary. His entry was a lot shorter. "Visit from Brahms, a genius." Isn't that amazing? What happened next will be our subject of class number 2. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day. Thank you. Thank you. I'll see you next week for Life with the Schumanns and Life immediately after. And we'll start talking about, Clara and, yeah.